All right, well, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of our Sea Grant Spotlight Liaison webinar series. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Davin Holen, who is a Coastal Community Resilience Specialist for Alaska Sea Grant in the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences and works collaboratively with the Alaska Center for Climate Assessments and Policy at the International Arctic Research Center, which is a NOAA RISA program. Davin facilitates workshops and other activities related to coastal resilience, addressing monitoring, mitigation, and adaptation to local stressors from climatic and ocean changes. So thank you, Davin.
Great, yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm going to go through and just talk about a few of the activities that I do as a Sea Grant liaison. And just briefly, I wanted to describe my program and what that means. So have been in this position since 2016, and it was a collaboration between Alaska Sea Grant and the National Sea Grant Office to put together a position that was seen as needed for Alaska, which is a coastal community resilience specialist. And so this position came about with funding from the National Sea Grant Office, where they went to different NOAA line offices like the Climate Program Office, the RISA, to the Office for Coastal Management, the National Weather Service. All of them helped fund this initial position. And so this has been going on for quite some time now. And so today it's kind of morphed into a real collaboration between Alaska Sea Grant and the NOAA RISA, which is the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy at UAF. And so I work really on both teams, but my position at the university is in the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. So today I'm going to talk about 4 different aspects of this position. I'm going to talk about the coastal resilience workshops, which kind of got me started. Some decision support tools I worked on. Recently, we did some work on oil spill science. And then I've also provided some social science expertise to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council to help with their efforts. So the coastal community resilience workshops are started out in 2016 with a BIA grant to the Aleutian Pearl Islands Association as part of the landscape conservation cooperatives. And those were a large-scale project under the last administration to do big ecosystem scale type of work and planning. And so in Alaska, we have the Western Alaska Landscape Conservation Cooperative. We had the Aleutian Bering Sea Islands. We had one in the Arctic, and then also the North Pacific and in the interior. And so today they've kind of changed, but at that time they were housed at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I got involved with them fairly quickly. I started work on it Tuesday, and by Friday I was in a meeting to help plan some of these workshops in Western Alaska. And so I'm going to talk about that experience and then how that actually has changed into a new program called Adapt Alaska. Over the last 4 years or so, in doing this work, I've come to understand that there's kind of a process to resilience. And so this is my little flow chart of how I kind of understand that process. And in some cases, we really just started a conversation. So it's taking science to communities and helping them understand, what's going on in their environments, but then turning around and listening to their experiences and understanding how those changes are impacting their livelihoods. That's kind of usually followed by a vulnerability assessment to look at specific vulnerabilities to communities, especially in the coastal areas of Alaska. That typically is followed up by some kind of monitoring. So once you identify what those vulnerabilities are, you need to monitor some of those changes. And then you start planning mitigation strategies. How are you going to mitigate based on the changes that are happening? And then the final part of the process is actual adaptation. And that's, to me, is looking at planning for future generations. How are you actually going to adapt to the changes that are coming, not those that are here today, but also those into the future. And so that you can do that in a way that builds resilience in your community. So we started in Western Alaska, and the things that stood out the most. These are the biggest issues that people saw. And so we did workshops in Nome, which was followed by a workshop down in Unalaska and the Aleutian Islands. We also had one in King Salmon. And then finally, we did a final workshop in Kotzebue. And so in the Bering Sea region, these are the things that they're seeing as their major issues. There's a reduction in sea ice. And usually by this time of year, there's shore-fast ice, and the fall and winter storms that come typically just blow snow into communities. However, with the reduction of sea ice and shore-fast ice, it's actually water that's coming in. And so they're seeing, in some cases, coastal inundation. Those storms are actually causing massive coastal erosion. This is coupled with a somewhat relative sea level rise right now. And in that area of Alaska, the land is actually not rising faster than the ocean as it is in some parts of Alaska, where we have isostatic rebound from the last glacial epoch. So in Western Alaska, the land is actually static or slightly sinking, and so the sea level rise could be a major impact. Ocean acidification is also a problem. In Alaska, our waters are old and cold. And so that's especially in the nearshore environment, there's a lot of work being done by tribes to try to monitor for that and try to understand what those impacts might be to resources that are important for subsistence. And I'm actually part of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, and I lead the tribal working group where we put together a whole conglomeration of tribes across Alaska that are doing some of that research in the nearshore environments. And then finally, we have permafrost thaw. And the permafrost is thawing quickly. It's changing the actual landscape itself. It's going from a tundra environment to a boreal forest environment in some areas. And that is also causing some disruption in subsistence patterns. As the environment changes, the fauna changes as well. During that period of time, we also did some workshops in Southeast Alaska, and I'm going to talk a little more about that. They're experiencing warmer air temperatures and snowfall variation. Southeast Alaska is, a similar climate to the northwest United States, but it's just a little bit colder, and so they get a good amount of snow, but the temperature is slightly rising. And because of that, there's a difference between how much precipitation comes as snow and how much comes as rain. And interestingly, because of that, there's less of a snowpack. There's the waters and the streams in the spring are not as cold. This has impacts for salmon, for example. And even last summer, they actually experienced a drought in Southeast Alaska, which is very unusual. The warming ocean temperatures are also having an impact on their resources. They also are monitoring for ocean acidification. Toxins such as harmful algal blooms in their shellfish species are a problem. And the Sitka Tribe, Sitka Tribe of Alaska, for example, monitors for those for tribes throughout Southeast Alaska because here in Alaska, shellfish are monitored for commercial reasons, but not for people that are using them for home use. And so the Sitka Tribe is providing that service. And so, lastly, they were concerned about the forest cover. They're one of the species that is important for Tlingit and Haida culture, the yellow cedar, which is used in a lot of cultural elaborations such as masks and boxes, totem poles. Those species are actually dying out because of the lack of snow cover. And so with the lack of snow, the cold weather that does come later on actually freezes out the root systems, which are very shallow in those species, and actually does kill the trees, and it kills entire forests. One of the things that we identified quickly was a need to monitor temperatures in the riverine environment for Southeast. And so a group of us put together a project funded by Alaska Sea Grant to monitor stream temperatures. That was also already being done by the Southeast Alaska Watershed Coalition, who did receive some funding from the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And they were training tribal environmental program managers to actually monitor streams throughout Southeast Alaska. And these are some of the streams that have been monitored by tribes or by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game or other organizations, including the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. And these streams, what they need is 1 year of good stream temperature monitoring data. And with that, we can try to understand what the future might hold for some of those streams. And so salmon in Alaska are a very iconic species. They're a very resilient species. They come back every year, and they're really a staple of subsistence production in Alaska. I in the past did subsistence research, and we found that probably about 60% of the harvest of wild resources in Alaska for home use for subsistence is actually salmon. So they're very important species for Alaskans. But stream temperatures and flows are really affecting their growth and survival rates in the freshwater environment where they rear. So we're trying to gather some data to try to understand what some of those changes are, especially when it comes to dissolved oxygen in the riverine environment that are important for salmon. And the goal of this project is to actually build a model that a tribe could upload 1 year of stream temperature monitoring data that they collect, and then it would project into the future what abundance in that stream might look like. And so they can actually make decisions about what streams they want to focus on, which ones that might have the greatest greatest ability for harvest into the future. And so those are the streams they might want to focus on ensuring the survival of. Health and economics is another focus that we looked at. And so another lens in which we look at resilience. This is the community of Port Heiden. This is their beach area, and you can see there's a erosion going on there, and it's pretty extensive. This community sits on pumice. It's the result of the Aniakchak volcano that went off several centuries ago, and because of that, it floats away very quickly, and so they're having a lot of erosion with winter and fall storms taking the beach away. And over to the right, underneath the circle there, I apologize for that, is the edge of a lake. And that lake has actually breached. So this picture was taken about 1.5 years ago, and all of that you're looking at right now is gone. And that lake is actually breached and is now flowing out into the ocean. And so they're trying to figure out how to utilize that space. They've lost their harbor because of erosion, but that lake could be a potential location. So when we went to there, we looked at health as the One Health concept as a key indicator for resilience, but we also looked at economics. How could some of the changes in the environment benefit the community in a way? They would like to reestablish their community as an economic center. To bring in fishing boats. They have built a seafood processing plant, but they actually have no location to actually land that seafood out on the beach. And so they were looking at trying to build a harbor. And so that lake could be a potential, for example. We're also looking at fresh water, where they could get a better fresh water source. Their water has a lot of iron in it because of their volcanic soils. And so is there a way to bring in better water source that benefits the community, but also can help run that seafood processing plant to build more of an economy? Recently, in the YK Delta, we worked on a plan for that area, kind of climate adaptation strategy. And the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta is an area with about 56 communities. There's some of the largest rural communities in Alaska, and they're also some of the most underserved. And so this region has a lot of issues from declining salmon runs, permafrost thaw is really impacting their infrastructure. There's also changes in their harvest patterns for large land mammals going on in the area. And so there's a lot of issues in this region. And so when we went into the community, we wanted to try to understand what are those changes. Some of the things that were being shown to community members were maps like this that basically show the disappearance or the inundation of a lot of landscape. And this isn't really a very good way to quantify what is actually going to happen. And in some ways, it really scares people. So we tried to bring in some better data. And the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center put together some great maps for the community to show things like permafrost thaw, what some of the changes might be. And so these are better ways to look at where communities might want to think about focusing their energy. We recognized very quickly that we couldn't take on all of the things that were happening in this area. And so we came up through a steering committee process of identifying 3 key focus areas that we were going to look at. The subsistence drying of fish is very important. And so species come back, the salmon come back early in the spring. They come into the rivers and people are able to harvest them and dry them before the rainfall sets in and before the flies come out. But unfortunately, what's happening is the salmon are coming back later. They require a lot of cold water in the river before they'll start entering the river systems. That is not happening, so they're coming in later. And because of that, the fisheries managers have closed the fisheries until the salmon reach their spawning grounds. And so because of that, people are having to harvest the salmon later, which gets into the rainy season. And there is also a lot of flies, which can spoil them in the smokehouse. And so we looked at different technologies, different ways of actually maybe possibly wrapping the smokehouses in some kind of mesh that still allows for a breeze to come in, but also keeps the flies out. Canning technologies to can the fish, maybe switching from drying to canning, things like that. Community infrastructure is a real issue in this region. You can see there that in one of the pictures that a lot of the infrastructure for water and wastewater runs on top of the ground. And that is because of the permafrost in this region. That permafrost is thawing and it causes a lot of problems with that community infrastructure. That some of those pipes get pulled away from homes. The homes have to constantly over the course of a year be reset. People go out and they level them often. And so, infrastructure themselves is also coupled with the inundation and coastal erosion that is happening in this region. And so there's some planning that needs to go on. And then finally, travel and trails. The Yukon-Kuskokwim Wildlife Refuge is one of the largest wildlife refuges in the country. It's also important bird habitat, but it does get degraded by the travel between different communities. Air travel is the means to get between communities. There are no roads, and so people fly, but it's very expensive. So oftentimes they take their ATVs instead, because some of these communities are actually quite close. But that degrades the environment. And so they're looking at better ways to build trails between communities so that people can get safely between communities while at the same time not degrading the environment. One of the other areas in Alaska that we've been focusing on is Southeast, and I mentioned that already. We worked with the Southeast Alaska tribes through the Central Council of Klukwan and Haines Indian Tribes of Alaska and the Sitka tribe to do a regional climate adaptation plan. And this was an outcome of the workshop that we did in Southeast. And so over the last few years, the Sitka tribe and Central Council of Klukwan and Haines have been working on that plan. And the Central Council of Klukwan and Haines actually hired somebody to write that. And last May, we actually did a workshop to kind of look at that plan that I facilitated. And then we thought about better ways to improve it and actually adapt it to different communities. And so this is one of those communities. This is the community of Klukwan, which is near Haines in the upper part of Lynn Canal in Southeast Alaska. And this is a workshop. We did 2 workshops there. I led a workshop the first day in Klukwan to look at impacts to infrastructure. I brought in some information provided by the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center that looked at snowpack changes, for example. temperature changes in the region, what they can expect into the future. And so for the first day, we looked at tribal services, thinking about things like water delivery, where they're going to focus their water systems. And so for example, they may want to think about looking at more rain-fed systems instead of systems that are driven by snowpack, because into the future, there will be a reduction in snowpack. So changing where their water sources come from. They're also thinking about the heat. This last year in Alaska, we had some of the most extreme heat we've ever had, and it also impacted areas like Southeast Alaska. They spent a lot of time driving up to Whitehorse and buying air conditioning units at the Walmart up there. I know in Anchorage, we had air conditioning units. Shipment came into Costco, and you stood in the line outside and got a number, and only a certain amount of people were allowed in to buy them. And so, it's becoming somewhat extreme. So they're thinking about, okay, if we need to renovate our homes, how do we do that? We need to renovate them so that we can keep the smoke out because we have a lot of fires, but we also need to allow fresh air in, and we also need to start thinking about cooling our homes during the summer, because that does have health impacts, especially for the elder population in these communities. On the second day, we focused on subsistence in the Chilkat Valley and invited the Chilkoot Indian Association. So in Klukwan, they have the Chilkat Indian Association, and then in Haines, there's the Chilkoot Indian Association. And so we had both of those groups work together to think about changes in the Chilkat Valley and the upper part of the Lynn Canal. And this is one of the first times the tribes have worked together since they were actually split apart during the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And so they're really excited to think about how they could work together to address some of the changes in the subsistence harvests in the valley that they share. Back in recently, in October, we also had the Adapt Kodiak workshop. This was another one that was funded by the Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and I facilitated this in Kodiak. Kodiak is one of the largest seafood ports in the United States. It's a very modern island, at least in terms of the city itself. It also hosts one of the largest Coast Guard bases in the United States as well. And so it's an important location for economics in terms of fisheries. We talked about also, though, there are other communities on the island that are not as well connected and are starting to look at how they can develop their economies. And so, for example, on the left, we have the Kodiak Archipelago Leadership Institute talking about agricultural production and how they're trying to develop more agricultural in some of these outlying communities and food. Infrastructure in the region is in the city is actually very highly developed. They get most of their power from hydro sources, or they have wind turbines on the hillside over Kodiak and produce almost over 98% of their electricity is powered by renewable sources. And so we talked about how we could try to expand that technology, for example, to outlying communities on the island. This workshop focused on fisheries futures, thinking about fisheries into the future, the infrastructure and energy, like I just mentioned. But we also talked about subsistence harvests and how that is changing on the island, and as well as culture. And being a seafood port, it's a highly diverse community. There is a large Filipino community, for example, that works in the fish processing plants. And we talked about how we can try to bridge the gap between some of the different cultures on the island to create a more cohesive space for people to better understand each other. And so that was kind of the last outcome of the workshop. So over the last few years, we've shifted thinking about these coastal resilience workshops into something that we called Adapt Alaska. And so this is a name we came up with, and we've kind of applied this to some of the different workshops we've done. So we shifted, for example, into, we now call the project in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta the Adapt YK. We have Adapt Kodiak, Adapt Southeast. And to kind of facilitate some of the information sharing, we developed a website called Adapt Alaska. And this website does two things. It talks about what's changing, gives kind of an overview of changes that are going on in the environment. We've developed some posters. There are three of these. This one is, for example, sustaining subsistence, life, and culture as the climate changes. And so what the climate change means to actually subsistence patterns across the state and how those might be changing. We sent three of these posters out. They were fairly good size to about 500 participants over the workshops. And the one thing I wanted to mention about these is that these posters started off as just white paper with a few drawn images on them, and 200 participants across the 4 different workshops in Western Alaska worked on those posters. They provided text, they provided the focus areas, they talked about what they wanted to see, and so these posters, although they're visually striking, were originally just kind of hand-drawn, and they were the work of over 200 participants in those workshops. So we've got different focus areas for what's changing. We tell the story through the posters. We also have different pages that talk about things like coastal erosion and flooding, ocean acidification, what are harmful algal blooms, kind of just giving people the basic science. And then we talk about how we can adapt. And so these are different adaptation strategies. For example, this picture here shows some kids at the top, and they're holding up carrots that were grown in the community garden in Tyonek. This is one of my favorite examples. This community garden is now a farm, and Tyonek is one of the closest communities to Anchorage. It has about 120 households or so. And so it's a fairly small community, but they produce in the summer a lot of the food that they need, both to sell inside the community. It supports the elders' lunches, and it employs about 6 kids at the school. Oftentimes the kids there aren't very many jobs in the community. They sometimes move into Anchorage for the summer, live with relatives. So this provides the opportunity for them to do all the starts at the school in the spring. Then they move them out to the garden. All the kids participate in planting, and then some of them are hired to work at the farm over the summer. The produce is actually backhauled into Anchorage and sold at stores as well. And so that supports the garden program. And it also provides food for the elders' lunches that are produced every day, that are made up of wild foods such as salmon and moose and other things, and then vegetables from the garden. Soon we're going to have a new website. It's in development, and I'm calling this Adapt Alaska 3.0. The first version was kind of a static website. The second version allowed me to add a few things, but the third version will look completely different, and it will be much more efficient and easy to work on. The other part of it that we're working on is actually an adaptation planning tool for communities. So kind of walking them through the process. And I have somebody working on that right now that has kind of reviewed all the adaptation plans that have been done across Alaska, and kind of coming up with some best practices of putting together an adaptation plan. A couple of different other things that I've been working on, just to give you a taste of some of the things that as a Sea Grant liaison I also do, working on decision support tools. This is a project, for example, that was funded by the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management through the Coastal Marine Institute at the College of Fisheries and Ocean Science, and it was taking human dimensions information that was produced as part of household harvest surveys. I came from, before this, my first career was at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the Division of Subsistence, where I was a regional manager and subsistence program manager, and I helped develop a mapping protocol that provided harvest information for communities across Alaska. And so we took some of the map data that was available and displayed it into the Alaska Ocean Observing Systems data portal as part of the Cook Inlet response tool that was developed between the Alaska Ocean Observing System and the Cook Inlet Regional Citizens Advisory Council. And so this tool, the goal of it is to provide planners when they're doing oil exploration, or if there is a technological disaster, an oil spill, with information about what communities in Cook Inlet are doing in terms of harvest and what months they might be out harvesting, what resources they're focusing on, and what areas they're going to. So they can effectively plan better to avoid those areas during certain periods of time, or they can focus on those areas that are most critical for harvest if there is a technological disaster. And so this is our main interface for that tool. It's as part of the Cook Inlet response tool. We have information about how communities are accessing sites, whether they're using a boat or a snow machine. The community itself, there are just a few communities represented for Cook Inlet. The harvest method, so they may be out dip netting in certain areas, or they might be rod and reel fishing. What kind of species they're harvesting? Are they focusing on salmon or non-salmon fish? Are they hunting moose? And then what season? And that tool actually has by month. So what months they would be out there. And so this is an example of all of the data that is available for that region. And then if we looked at how people are accessing areas, you could look at boat, for example. This is how people are accessing it by boat. We also have broken this down by different species. And so hopefully this will give developers an idea of what communities are doing at certain times of the year. I did take this out as kind of a follow-up. I went to the village councils in Seldovia, Nanwalek, and Tyonek, three of the communities that were part of this study, and provided data. And I asked them, is this useful for you? And if it is useful, what other kind of layers would you like to see? And so all three locations, basic summary is that they found that this represented, it represents the diversity and scope of resources that they harvest. So that ensures that people understand that people aren't just fishing, they do lots of different things, and that they're out there all the time harvesting resources. They talked about how shellfish have changed over time, clams and other shellfish species have really disappeared from Cook Inlet. And there are efforts to try to reintroduce some species to Cook Inlet, but they've really disappeared. And so they would like that represented into this, especially when thinking about contaminants. And so there is a contaminant layer which we can overlay on top of shellfish harvest, for example, to show where those intersections might be. They want to recognize that harvest activities change all the time. And so this is 1 year of data for these communities, but it doesn't always represent what's going on. And so that developers should really understand that although, it may show what's going on at certain times of years, there is definitely some difference between different years. And so they should be aware of that. As part of the next steps, I did a project for the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council looking at the Bering Sea region. And so this is harvest data from 27 communities in the Bering Sea. It's not as detailed. We just have it by species and community. Some of the communities are missing month, for example. Some are missing access. And so we just looked at it by species category and by community. And so we'll have this available as a tool on the Alaska Ocean Observing System data portal. And this, for example, just shows marine mammal harvests. And I put this one up because when thinking about federal fisheries management, it's important to understand that people don't just harvest marine mammals right in front of their communities inside the state waters, that they go far outside of state waters into federal waters to harvest. And so fisheries managers should understand that there may be intersections between what's going on for commercial activity in the Bering Sea and what people are doing for subsistence. I'd also like to think about doing this for the Prince William Sound region. And this goes into one of my next discussions. And that is that over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with the Prince William Sound Regional Systems Advisory Council. I'm on their scientific advisory committee. And we did an oil spill workshop recently together. I've been talking with them about thinking about response tools that they could use in Prince William Sound. And so we could develop something like this for Prince William Sound as well. And I do have data, recent data that was collected in 2015, which would be very useful for that. So oil spill science, one of the last things I'm going to discuss in February of this last year, as part of a National Academies Gulf Research Program grant, the National Sea Grant Program, the Oil Spill Science Group put together 5 different workshops that were in different parts of the United States, and Alaska was the second one. We started off in Holen, Louisiana, and I went down for that to just see how that went. And then this was followed up by the Anchorage one. And so we looked at health, social, and economic disruptions back in 2017. I attended a workshop at the National Academies where they started talking about health. A lot of focus is really on the environment, but oil spills also impact human health. They impact and the social and economic well-being of communities as well. And so I brought in different speakers to talk about that. We focused on learning from the past. We looked at impacts to health. I used the case study of the Prince William Sound herring fishery crash as an impact to economics because of the oil spill and the Exxon Valdez oil spill in that area. The herring fishery crashed. There's also other factors that possibly influenced that crash as well. But the oil spill was a definite major factor. And that had a major impact on the economy. It meant that people couldn't, the herring fishery allowed commercial fishermen to harvest year round. And so it provided them with that extra income that allowed them to just be commercial fishermen. But with the loss of the herring fishery, really salmon is the only thing left, and people often have to get other jobs as well. And so this really disrupted the economic fabric of communities throughout Prince William Sound. And fishing boats have disappeared from the docks of many communities throughout Prince William Sound. We also talked about shifting patterns and trends in subsistence economies, and we had the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. My former boss and mentor, Jim Fall, came and talked about impacts to subsistence in that region. He had been doing harvest surveys and talking with people in those communities since before the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and had done a number of studies some of which I participated in over the years since 2003. We looked at, we brought some panels together, and this is a speaker from the Institute, retired from the Institute of Social Economic Research, that talks about different impacts in terms of commercial fishing and tourism and impacts to economies. We looked at actual protocols for dealing with disasters, and this image shows Joe Banta from the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council talking about our Coping with Technological Disasters Guidebook, which was also used during the Deepwater Horizon event. And I'm working on updating that right now as part of our activities with the Prince William Sound RCAC to modernize it for today. And so this workshop was a great opportunity to really think about human health, to think about impacts to communities. I brought in people from all over Alaska. We had 5 elders from Bering Strait come in, and we talked about what could, the potential impacts in that region as they see an increase in ship traffic, and how that might impact what happens if a spill happens near the community. There are very few federal resources for response in the Bering Sea, but the increasing ship traffic really has people worried, because communities will probably have to be the ones to respond first, because it will take so long to get a response vessel there. And so we drew all those impacts out. This is a great poster that kind of shows some of the things that we talked about throughout the workshop. And then we had a report to the National Academies, which is also available from the Sea Grant Oil Spill Science team. And finally, I just want to mention that, as an anthropologist and with a long background in history and studying subsistence economies, Sometimes I've been given tasks or requested to provide information or expertise on different projects using my social science skills. And so this is an example of that, the Bering Sea Fishery Ecosystem Plan. I was appointed by the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council to be part of that team as a social scientist. And I helped write the traditional ecological knowledge section of that, as well as the subsistence section, and try to help think about ways in which we could use that type of data in fisheries management. And that's now been turned over to a kind of a task force made up of social scientists from across Alaska, as well as local community members, to think about how to operationalize that information into the fisheries plan. So that's what I have for today. We will have a new website, Adapt Alaska, that comes out sometime in the new year in January or February. And it's going to look completely different. But the important part of that is helping communities make plans and how to use resources that are out there. I was very frustrated when I came to this position. There was not a lot of good information specific to Alaska. There's some great information out there about resilience. We have the climate toolkit, NOAA resources, but I wanted something that really pulled together all of the best information for Alaska. And so we did that as part of the first website, and we're going to really streamline it and make it much more useful for community members as they start to think about how to build resilience in their communities. So thank you for listening. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you so much, Davin. And this is Erin Cheever with the NOAA Central Library. We do have some questions coming in online, and I apologize as we're wrapping up a holiday party here, so there's a little bit of ambient good cheer noise. But the first question that we have for you is someone who wanted to know, I'm curious if you know anyone in Alaska that is working on carbon dioxide sequestration / ocean acidification mitigation around Alaska, as through kelp farming, ocean alkalinity enhancement, etc.
That's actually a great question. And so that's something that the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network has been talking about. There are some farms and beginning stages of thinking about that in places like Southeast Alaska and Kodiak Island. There is a new funded effort by Melissa Good, who just got some funding from the National Sea Grant Program to look at aquaculture in the Aleutian Islands. And so Melissa might be a good person to talk to. She's done a lot of the research already thinking about that. Most of the kelp farming that is going on in Alaska is from natural sources, but there is a real interest in planting some of those kelp farms near shellfish locations. We do have some shellfish farms in Kachemak Bay and other places, Southeast Alaska, for example. So there is some interest in that, but I would definitely go to the Alaska Sea Grant site and look at the directory and contact Melissa Good, who is kind of been looking at that. Another resource for that is Gary Freitag, who is our agent in Ketchikan, and he works with a lot of the shellfish farmers down there.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. Another question that we had here was if you have any thoughts on tourism, especially cruise ship industry impacts, maybe education of tourists regarding Adapt Alaska concerns?
Oh, that's a very good question. That is one area that we really feel like we're missing in our program. We've talked about that in Southeast Alaska. As most people know, we get a number of cruise ships on any given day. There are 5 of them pulled up in front of Juneau. And so there is some efforts by some groups in Alaska. For example, the Hoona Indian Association has been working to provide more information to tourists in the community of Hoona. They're starting to get cruise ships pull into there. So some of the tribes are doing some of that. Here at Alaska Sea Grant, we have actually lost our tourism specialist. Over the last 4 years, we've gone from we've had a 40% reduction in faculty and staff because of what's going on with our statewide economy. But we're hoping to rebuild that and hopefully in the future have somebody that can work on things like tourism. and education. We did play with the idea of putting a sea grant location in Juneau, for example, or other places, but it's just not something we can think about right now.
Okay, and then we actually just had another question come in regarding Adapt Alaska. So someone said, are there any other coastal resiliency and planning models you looked at to base the Adapt Alaska program on, either in the US or other countries, or was this totally organic?
I was a little bit of both. I started out looking at the Nature Conservancy's resilience sites. They're mostly map-based, but the website itself is fairly organic, and it was based on all the materials that we put together for the coastal resilience workshops in Western Alaska. Those existed in paper format, and my goal was to get them out there. So instead of just having a PDF of a kind of a static paper copy of the information, I wanted to make it more interactive. And so that's why we developed the website. So it was based on all the information from that. I do know that there are some other resilience sites that we kind of look through. There is one in Australia that our current designer, Carolyn Rosner at UAF, is looking at. And she has pulled some of their design strategies for the new website. And so I think that was one that we looked at. That was a resilience group in Australia for the new website. But for the most part, it's been fairly organic, just trying to think about how we can make this really Alaska specific and kind of tell the story of Alaskans building resilience in different communities and how they can share that story with other Alaskans.
Okay, and the next question we have for you here is, as you talk about climate change, resilience, and adaptation, do you still meet people who question if climate change is happening? And what can the rest of the U.S. do to help spread the need for change and urgency?
That is a good question for Alaska. There is very little denial by anybody in Alaska that climate change is happening. There may be some there may be those that specifically don't attribute human activity to that, but for the most part, most Alaskans know that climate change is happening. And in a lot of communities, we also talk about how at the local community level, they can offset their own carbon emissions. And so there's been a lot of effort to put renewable energy into rural communities. But it's also because the cost of diesel is about $6 a gallon in a rural community. And so communities have been able to really offset their own carbon emissions because they're actually saving money. So there is that recognition, but for the most part, across Alaska, there's a definite recognition that climate change is happening, and it's happening much more rapidly than we thought. And the loss of sea ice in the Bering Sea and the cascade effect that could actually happen. The fact that we had some really strange winters, we've had lots of droughts, extreme forest fires, especially this past year with extreme heat. Most Alaskans know that climate change is occurring. And I think it really takes actually experiencing that firsthand before you really understand that is the case.
Okay, so another question we had in this vein is, what are the best skills that a scientist could concentrate on, as in retraining and learning to inform work in this field, such as social policy, anthropology, GIS, data analytics, etc.?
Okay, that's a good question. I think when I was hired for my position, they were actually looking for a physical scientist, and they were looking for somebody who was a climate scientist, and they ended up with an anthropologist. And I think one of the reasons for that was just the recognition that working directly with communities is important. And I think the most important thing, one of the reasons I was hired was because I had worked for almost 20 years with rural communities across Alaska and actually had those connections with those communities. And so I think one of the most important things you can do is actually build rapport with communities. So if you want to work in an area, really get to know the community well. and understand what their issues are, and then try to build your research around some of those things. Because if you can actually really engage the people that you're working with in areas that they're really interested in, or work to help them understand why they should be really interested, I think it's much more rewarding in the end. And I did a lot of subsistence work, and so for example in Southeast I would work on herring fisheries with communities and helping to think about subsistence herring harvest and the impact of commercial fisheries on those harvests. And then we turned around and talked about climate change, and I think in many ways those two were really intertwined for the community. And so it's just a matter of how you can actually engage those communities in that conversation, and helping them understand that the work that's going on is really critical for their future.
And someone would also like to know, is anyone hiring for positions like these in Alaska?
Yes. Not at the university, for example. Like I said, we've lost about 40% of our funding on our staff and faculty. But the Environmentally Threatened Communities program at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium is a great place to look. They have done some great work recently. They started with one person. I think there's 3 or 4 people there now. I saw an ad for a position recently, and they're working directly with communities to help write grants and to bring some of the really necessary critical things, funding to those communities to help them address their issues, and also working with communities to identify what those issues are and how to best address them. So I think it's the people I know over there, it seems to be a very rewarding program.
Great. And then also someone just had a comment. They had some Washington State resources that they thought you might find helpful for Adapt Alaska 3.0. So they sent some links over, and we will get those to you after the webinar. So yeah, and that's all that I'm seeing right now. So I think that's it for today. Do you have anything else, Davin?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to talk about this and help people see what's going on in Alaska. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great day. Bye.